Bienvenidos a un nuevo capítulo de Apasionados por la Tecnología, el podcast de Paradigma Digital sobre tecnología, estrategia, metodología y productos digitales. ¡Arrancamos!
Hoy tenemos el honor de entrevistar a Chris Williams, fundador de Badass Agile y referente en liderazgo ágil en Canadá. Chris es un innovador que impulsa a líderes y equipos a adoptar una mentalidad ágil en todas las áreas de sus vidas y organizaciones. Además, Chris va a impartir una de las keynotes de la CAS, la conferencia Agile Spain, que se celebra hoy y mañana en Madrid y de la que Paradigma Digital es patrocinador. Soy Maribel Tirados, esto es Apasionados por la Tecnología y en el episodio de hoy hablaremos de un concepto clave en el mundo actual, la antifragilidad. Junto a Chris vamos a analizar cómo los líderes pueden transformar sus organizaciones para que prosperen frente a la adversidad, adaptándose no solo a los cambios, sino beneficiándose de ellos. También contamos con Mauricio Andrés Contrera. Mauricio forma parte del equipo de Agile en Paradigma y será el encargado de conducir hoy la entrevista en inglés. Mauricio, Chris, cuando queráis.
Muchas gracias, Maribel. Chris, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you
Could
for
you
having
briefly
me.
introduce yourself to our audience and share how you first connected with the concept of antifragility, please?
Sure. So my name's Chris Williams. I'm the host of the Badass Agile podcast. I've been in tech for about 30 years. Yeah, I would say. So I started as a Microsoft certified trainer back in 1994. So that puts us at about 30 years ago. And I've been everything from a developer to an architect to a consulting executive to a trainer. And I think training really is where my heart is. But as I was working along as a developer, I found myself on these agile teams every once in a while. And at first I didn't really love it. And then I started to really like it. So I became a scrum master and an agile coach. And, at a certain point, I was studying the success patterns and habits of Navy SEALs. And I was working in a program called Unbeatable Mind, where I was learning how the best of the best do what they do in situations where they can't fail. And I was interested to see how much overlap there was between what they do and what agilists do. But of course, also interested in where there is no overlap, where they're very different. And that was the root of the Badass Agile podcast, which then became a course that I teach called The Forge, which is a year-long immersion experience for leaders. And now we have the Forge Genesis, which is the same thing, but it's geared at people who are agile practitioners who are entrepreneurial. So maybe they want to become their own training business. They want to release courses. Maybe they want to write books. Maybe they want to start a consultancy. What are all the marketing and selling and branding skills that an agilist needs, but probably has never been trained on to make it easier for agilists to move to the next level of their career? Because as we know, the market's a little bit overcrowded. So that's what I'm working on these days. My introduction to antifragility came from my time studying resilience in the Unbeatable Mind program. So what makes people quit when things get difficult? In fact, I have a theory that when work isn't working, the reason is usually people's discomfort with discomfort. People don't like being uncomfortable. And that could mean there's areas where they're afraid of being rejected or laughed at or seen as an imposter or seen as unfit or not good enough somehow. Or there's a fear of failure that if this goes wrong, I could lose my job or worse. Generally speaking, when work isn't moving, there's some element of not being comfortable with uncertainty, possibility of failure, et cetera, et cetera. So I became fascinated with what makes people quit versus persist in difficult times. And so the study of resilience, I spent a lot of time with, and I spent a lot of time teaching it. And then antifragility, of course, as you know, is a little bit different, but that was my avenue into antifragility, because I've long since believed that strength is probably the answer. We spend a lot of time making excuses or sometimes just saying, it's okay to not know the answer. It's okay to not work 18 hours a day as days. Of course it's okay. But at a certain point where a problem persists and we're unable to fix it easily, there comes a moment where certain people who persist longer, who thrive in environments of challenge and difference, where I think there's a part for them to play. So that's how I got interested in anti-fragility. Sorry, it's a long answer to a short question.
It is a very inspiring introduction, Chris. Thank you so much for that. As coined by Nassim Taleb, goes beyond resilience or adaptability. Instead of just resisting stress, anti-fragile systems actually grow stronger under pressure. From your experience, Chris, what elements are essential for a company to become genuinely anti-fragile?
So if we're talking about a company, because there's individual anti-fragility, which means how do you personally handle difficult situations where the outcome isn't clear, isn't certain or assured, but then there's applying it to an organization. So if we're speaking about an organization, why would an organization benefit from being anti-fragile? Well, anti-fragility refers to the idea from Taleb's book that it's not enough to be able to bounce back from hard times. It is important to welcome difficulty and challenge because it grows the muscles and the nerve endings that are required for success. So there's a saying that muscle doesn't grow until you tear it. For those of you who've ever been into bodybuilding or fitness, you would know that what happens when a muscle grows or gets bigger is it's actually being torn or damaged. And it's the automatic repairing of the muscle that the body does that creates greater mass and more mass, but also more capacity. The muscle is now capable of doing new things. Excuse me. If you've ever had an instance where you thought you were in really good shape, you hike every weekend, you run every day, but all of a sudden you were challenged, let's say, to play pickleball, and all of a sudden your joints start moving in ways that your joints have never moved before, you might be surprised to find that despite your overall level of fitness, there are some movements that you just never do. And so because those joints, those muscles, those tendons have never been challenged, they may be sore, they may hurt the first time that you do it. For an organization to become more anti-fragile, it has to be that way. It has to welcome the forces of disruption, evolution, change, and uncertainty that would normally threaten it. So we live in times where things change pretty radically overnight. Think about some of the weather events that we've had in 2024. Think about the COVID challenge that we had in 2020. Think about the recession we've been through in the past 2 to 3 years. All of those were unheralded, mostly unexpected, and yet we pride ourselves on our ability to adapt to those challenges. An organization has to welcome those kinds of changes. And so when you ask the question, what does an organization need to do to foster that? Number one is the understanding that it's only through those failures that you'll develop a resilience for failure. It's impossible to know the right way to do anything. Build software, staff a team, run an audit. It's impossible to know the right way to do any of those things until you start doing it, because the circumstances will be different from event to event, company to company, group to group, team to team. So if a company has to embrace anti-fragility as simply saying we welcome and are looking for the hard challenges that tear muscle so we can grow it. So we want the harder challenges. We want the higher bar, and we want to be comfortable in the unexpected. So that means that there needs to be some trust between the teams and the leadership that if I fail, there won't be repercussions, or at least there won't be serious repercussions for the kind of failure that we're trying to experiment with. But also there has to be some trust between the leadership and the teams that I trust you to do whatever you think is best, to build whatever you think will work. And we understand that we might be wrong. We might waste a little time or some resources, but that's the only way we will figure out what does work and how to grow. So a perfect case in point, if the market pivots and all of a sudden nobody's interested in your product anymore, but now AI has become the hottest, newest thing, what are the things that we will do? Where are we willing to experiment and try something new so that we can capitalize on this change rather than be sitting there going, what happened? What happened to our pie? AI came and stole all our pie. Don't you love us anymore? Don't you love our products anymore? And now there's a compulsion to add artificial intelligence somehow to the mix. And if you're not willing to look at it, you're not willing to play with it, you're not willing to fail with it, it's going to be hard for you to withstand the changes that are coming. And once it's no longer AI, it'll be something else.
Wow. Yeah, it's such a challenge for companies. And I can imagine with your experience that you worked extensively with leaders who embrace agility. How does the concept of continuous improvement evolve into an environmental that prioritizes antifragility over mere agility?
So the nice thing is that I think agile teams are or have the potential to be anti-fragile by their nature. Because we believe in continuous development, we should always be looking for the breaks in the system. So it's not unusual to test things to the point of failure, not test them for success. So we don't want to just run the use cases that we know will bring forward a positive. We're looking for those test cases that might break the software, stretch its limits, or confuse it or trick it a little because we haven't coded for or planned for that particular instance. It's really important to do that. So I think as agile teams, we understand the nature of anti-fragile testing and poking and trying to grow our product stability by making it intentionally unstable. So I think agile people get it by default. But I think to go beyond regular agility, I see an awful lot of agile teams that I wouldn't consider anti-fragile, despite the fact that they do continuous improvement. Example one, when we do retrospectives, we say things like, well, the cookies aren't very good, or the room's a little bit too hot, or there's too many lights on. We, again, being uncomfortable with discomfort, we sometimes go for the easy stuff, the things that we know won't hurt anybody's feelings, the things that won't make anyone feel like we're assigning blame or judgment of any kind. But if we can just go past that a little bit, and simply say, our process I don't think is working. I feel like it could have been faster. I feel like there was a hole in there where we let blockers go for too long. I feel like we haven't tested assumptions about what our customer will love or pay for. Sometimes when we poke harder and we challenge the comfortable assumptions, that's when an agile team becomes really powerful because they're not just testing for what they think will work, they're testing for what they think won't.
Interesting. Thank you for the answer. You know that we have a blog here in Paradigma Digital, and I wrote a recent article where I discuss how organizational culture is a crucial barrier to anti-fragility. Leaders often focus on stability and predictability, which might inhibit growth under pressure. What are your thoughts about fostering a culture that not only tolerates but actually seeks out disruption as a means of growth?
Sure. So that's a really good question. We forget that Microsoft once had a product called Microsoft Bob. And it was around the time of Windows 95 where Bill Gates personally wanted to create an operating system where all of the touch points were cartoon characters. So you wanted to balance your checkbook. There was a dinosaur holding your checkbook. You click on the dinosaur and off it went. So it was a more than marginal flop. Like nobody bought it. And they killed the project after maybe a year or two. Almost all the companies that you love have had massive visible failures. So SpaceX is one. They want rockets to explode when they're unmanned and inside the atmosphere because the cost of failure is much lower. And so it requires that we're comfortable investing in risk where you can control the downside. So if this rocket blows up, we know exactly how much it's going to cost, and we know exactly how much of that we can afford before we say, stop. There's too many failures. Something's not right. If you believe that the best way to make a team more productive and make their output more meaningful is by controlling their every move, that means big, long approval processes with multiple steps in the hierarchy. That means extensive documentation so that we have certainty by simply writing down all of our thoughts and feelings about everything that we're ever going to build, even if those thoughts and feelings never end up in the finished product. That's wasteful. So number one, too much control and too much certainty can be wasteful, but it also creates a comfort level with that kind of overhead that's trying to teach that the best way to be certain about things is to think about them for a really long time, which isn't true. The best way to find out about things is to do and to observe and to say, this didn't work, so we learn something. We learn that our customer is not responsive to these kinds of features. We learn that our customers don't care about X, but prefer to care about Y. An organization has to be willing, think about a record company. In the old days, one Aerosmith would pay for 10 or 20 acts that you've never heard of, that were never really going to be bankable, that ended up going nowhere. They might have put out 1 to 3 albums, but at the end of the day, they just didn't sell enough records for one reason or another. But having the one Aerosmith or the one Adele creates so much revenue that it funds all of the other artists who never gain any monetary traction. And so things like Microsoft Bob are the tech equivalent of Aerosmith versus the 10 bands that you've never heard of. When we make Microsoft Bob, we're rolling the dice. We think we're creating an interface that will resonate with a certain kind of user, but we were wrong. Technical people, especially early adopters, they like the technical challenge of learning an interface. They want the software to be effective, not easy. The only way to find that out is to put out and throw some serious money into Microsoft Bob, only to have it not work.
Well, yeah, it is a complex world with a lot of insights in these examples. Very, very inspiring. Let's jump to another topic. Let's talk about addressing organizational challenges and enablers. Empowering teams, as you have mentioned before, to make decentralized decisions is key tenet for Antifragilidad. Can you share successful examples where this has accelerated the company response to change?
Yes. So when I've worked with large firms, especially ones that are traditionally what we call entrenched, which means they're market winners already. Think of the big telcos or the big banks. Short of a serious oversight or miscarriage of some kind, it would be hard for those brands to lose their market position. It'd be hard for them to fail entirely. And yet, I've seen a couple of the really good ones have an area of investment, which we'll call it innovation, but what they're really doing is trying to come up with new ideas for their customer. And they're willing to say, let's spend $50,000 or $100,000 on any one of these ideas. And the ideas come from people who hear the voice of the customer. So customer service reps can come up with an idea, developers can come up with an idea, anybody can come up with an idea, but we're trying to move away from the top down, some VP says, oh, I have a great idea, we should build this. Rather, anybody can come up with an idea as long as they feel like it will be of service to the end customer, or of course to the company's stakeholders. But the idea is, I think customers would love this, but I don't know for sure. I can't prove it. So we can do a little bit of studying, but at the end of the day, you often can't tell how something's going to perform until you release it. So Agile understands that and it honors that. What we'll do is we'll say, okay, what would you build? What's the minimum that you would need to build for someone to test it, feel it, touch it, and say, yes, this helps me, or no, it doesn't. That kind of attitude from the senior level, that go ahead and build things, build interesting things. And when one of them catches your eye, when one of them gains some traction, when one of them really works and customers respond to it, then we'll think about, well, maybe we can go past the $50,000 or $100,000 investment threshold and really build something here. Let's go back to the market, ask people, if I built this, what would it include? What would it not include? Would it be a waste of time? What would be a great use of your time? How would you use this? Walk me through the process. So by pushing people into that creative zone where I'm not sure what will work, but I have an idea, and then funding those ideas, knowing that most of them won't pan out, I think that's a really good approach to risk. Mind you, we only do this in a limited, incubated way. So we're not trying to spread this practice to 100% of the organization, because that much risk could be frightening and could be fateful or fatal to an organization. But having a practice where good ideas come here, if there's things that we should be doing to make ourselves less likely to be disrupted, more likely to survive whatever's next in our industry, more likely to be able to capitalize on trends like AI or remote work to make our company better and to make sure that we survive longer, what you're doing is anticipating these problems before they're problems, which is what antifragility means to me, that we're constantly exploring the what ifs. You know who does this well is people who test for continuity. In a business, if all of a sudden the power grid goes out, what happens? Can we get ourselves safely downstairs? Do we know how to continue work from another location? How do we know that our data will survive the power outage? You have to test for those things. You have to run drills. You have to put yourself in harm's way, even if that harm is 100% fake. We have to put ourselves in situations where we test our ability to survive and thrive in those negative conditions. And to me, having those little innovation centers where we're constantly grooming, taking in, harvesting, building, and testing those ideas is a great way to do that.
Great. And talking about diversity of thought, skills and backgrounds often strengthens a company's ability to adapt. How can leaders actively cultivate diversity to reinforce their organization's antifragility without it feeling just another corporate initiative?
Well, as you know, most diversity initiatives are hard to do well. Many companies still struggle with doing them well. All I can say is that it begins with the one. So if you are in an environment where ideas are welcome and useful, get used to welcoming them from all sources and celebrating the fact that most great innovations, think about Tesla, think about the electric car. There's nothing new about the battery technology, the idea of rechargeable batteries. It's not new. There's nothing new about the concept of a car, 4 wheels, a seat, and a steering wheel. It's not new. What's new is the intersection of the two. And the unique problem that creates is, can we make a battery big enough so that the car can drive for a couple of hours? Otherwise, it's really not useful. There's no benefit to a car that can only go 20 kilometers before needing to be recharged. So it's the intersection of two things that have never intersected before that creates the most interesting innovation. So if you think of it that way, somebody from a different background, someone who doesn't look like me, doesn't speak like me, doesn't live near me, and hasn't had the same experiences or education as me, is probably going to bring something different, a different experience, a different way of looking at the world that, when intersected with what I already know, causes me to reconsider, to stretch, and to grow. So your question was, how do you implement or how do you support diversity? And the answer is simply start by listening to everything and judging nothing, and assume that any idea coming from anywhere could be the seed of a great new idea, a great new challenge, great new product, whatever. But it's not up to any one person to solve the whole diversity problem, but rather to prove from experience that a wealth of backgrounds, different backgrounds, are probably one of the easiest ways to harvest the intellect, the knowledge, and the passion of your entire workforce, especially when you treat all opinions and ideas equally.
Chris, you already mentioned about the safe to fail environment where team can learn from mistakes and push boundaries. And I know you work with Badass Agile, challenges conventional approaches to innovation without fear of repercussions.
I'm sorry, I missed the question. Was there a question?
How can leaders create this safe to fail environment without any fear of repercussions?
A great executive has to know that you can't plan for best ideas. Every person who sits down, let's say an author who writes a book, begins with a terrible first draft. It's always terrible. The point is to get the first draft out And from there, you see what's salvageable and what has to go and what needs refinement and what doesn't. If we've created the expectation that everything we do should be done faster and everything we do has to work the first time, then you create an environment in which people will be afraid of failure because you've used the word have to. The expectation is everything you do will result in a success. And if we cultivate that, we create an environment where if I make a mistake, I'm more likely to hide it or cover it up or not talk about it because the failure wasn't welcome. So it requires that, if you have leadership that believes that the best way to ensure success is to create more process, more rules, more procedures, and more adherence to those procedures, you're going to have an organization that's afraid to move outside their lane. So they're not going to feel free to innovate. They're certainly not going to feel free to fail because failure is defined as not following the process, which, as we discussed, probably won't get you anywhere. I don't know if you know this, but human bones, once they're broken, grow back stronger. Muscle doesn't grow until you tear it. If you want to excel, you have to stretch. So it's sometimes useful to look at executives and say, whom do we admire? Do we like Steve Jobs for what he did? Do we like, name another CEO? You might like Elon Musk, or you might like, name any famous company whose leadership you admire because of their innovation. Look at what they did. And what they did was not focus on getting ideas perfect, but rather to listen very carefully to what will be beneficial to the customer and to take calculated risks. So for a leader who's not used to that style of leading, somebody has to have the courage to say to them, innovation can't happen without experiencing failure. What we're going to do is control the size of those failures by keeping the investment small and short so that we can have certainty and clarity via feedback, real feedback from the people who use it or who encounter us as a company. Does this work or does this not work? So it's about a mind shift from certainty coming from process versus certainty coming from doing, failing, and adapting. The good news is once you make that a practice, the failures come less and less often because people who've been trained in this way of thinking know how to get to the good stuff sooner. They know how to generate good quality ideas first. So it does get better over time, but if you don't have a supportive executive layer, it won't work. And so sometimes the easiest way, as I said, is just who do we admire? Whose kind of creative and innovative output do we really want to mimic? Whose survivability? Like who lasted through the pandemic versus who didn't? Who are the people that were able to pivot and adapt and give generously and create stronger bonds with their audience? Who did that well? And if we intend to model those companies that we admire, we'll find that the tolerance for failure is main ingredient number one.
Well, we know now we have a great picture of the culture, the mindset that we need for making a company anti-fragile. But I know we have a lot of people in our audience that are leaders, professionals that want to have some practical steps to go beyond the anti-fragility and to start building anti-fragility. For that leader looking to make their organization anti-fragile, what would you just suggest they can begin? Is it by building the right team, changing the mindsets, anything else?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things you can play with. I always say willing minds and projects that fit. What that means is there will be people in your organization who are what we call hell yeah people, who are always like, I want to try that. I'll do that. I don't care if it doesn't work. I want to be on that team. You will find certain people who are more comfortable with discomfort. And those are the people that you should try to bring into early attempts to change or to impact the culture because they're already into it. If you take somebody who, when we suggest, hey guys, there's a new agile team spooling up over here, all you got to do is give up your desk by the window there and come and work in our team room for the next 12 weeks, they'll be like, wait. Do you know how hard I worked to get that spot? I want everything to be the same as it was yesterday. Don't move my desk. Don't move my view. Don't move my books, my stuff. I don't want to go anywhere new. Those may not be the best candidates for trialing an anti-fragile team. You want to look for people who consistently love to push themselves into their fear zone. What is it I'm not good at? So, for example, most people aren't good at cold calling to sell their ideas or sell their products. Most people struggle with getting up on stage and speaking in public. The people you're interested in are the people who know that about themselves and run straight into that challenge and say, every day I'm going to get up and I'm going to speak on camera for 10 minutes. And it's going to be awful, but just so I can get better. So should you start with a team? If you can identify people who are hell yeah people, bring them, because they'll make starting an anti-fragile effort easier. But also keep the container small. Don't try to do this for every department. Don't try to do this for everything. Pick one area where you want to be tested. So it could be in terms of continuity. It could be in terms of what would we do if all of a sudden a new competitor sprouted up and released the same product as us for half the price and we started losing customers. What would we do? You may want to look at what would we do if we had a privacy breach or a catastrophe of some kind and we had to go to the press and tell them what happened and what are we doing about it? Like, those are all examples of throwing yourselves into uncomfortable situations, because what paralyzes us in those situations is the fear. The fear that you experience when something happens, like, there's been a data breach, or there's a new competitor in town. The initial fear can be paralyzing because our bodies can't tell the difference if the attack coming from the outside is a logical fear, like, there's another competitor. Does that mean I'm going to lose my job? Versus a biological fear, like, that's a bear and it's within 3 feet of me and I could die here. Body can't tell the difference, really. And so you want to make sure that if you're introducing the idea that stress or pressure or testing or disruption is going to make us better, you don't want to do it in a way that actually pushes on people's red buttons too much, because we don't want to stress them out, because then the whole experiment will fail. And people say, I don't like this anti-fragility thing. It feels too real. It feels too hectic. But if you ever take first aid, the last thing you do when you take a first aid course is they walk you into a room with a bunch of people lying on the floor. And you have to figure out really quickly who's the most important person to treat first. And you have no information when you walk in. All you see is a bunch of people groaning, holding their arms, or not moving. And you have to have the calm and the foresight to move through that room and start asking good questions. But if your first instinct is to panic, you probably won't do anything. So I would say, try to make sure that if you're going to experiment with anti-fragility, start small. Don't try to change the whole organization at once. Start with willing minds, but also don't put people into situations that actually stress them out to the point of, mental discomfort, physical discomfort, because of course we'd like to avoid that. What we're trying to do is to say being disrupted is natural. There's nothing scary about it. We're going to be disrupted every day. Things are going to be hard every day. We're going to lose clients every day. We're going to have competitive threats every day. Our product's going to go out of date at least once a year. If we treat that event as being non-critical, yes, we have to respond to it, but wouldn't it be better if we planned for it before it became an event? And if we could do that by simply putting, not necessarily putting ourselves into a stress condition, but simply asking the question, what do customers think of us right now? Are we letting them down? Are we helping them, etc.? And when we gather some of that feedback, it's easy for us to see where our weak spots are. And that to me is a lot less threatening than throwing everyone into a room and saying, servers are down, lights are out. What do? Go. That's probably the wrong kind of stress to test.
Yeah, undoubtedly having a healthy environment for making these experiments is the key. But you know that we are in a world that often rewards the short-term success. So this is a different perspective. But how can leaders promote a mindset that values long-term resilience and growth, even if it requires challenging short-term stability?
Well, I'm sure every great leader would know a little bit about the stock market and understand that there are short-term gains where you can invest heavily, but in a much higher risk scenario where if it works out in your favor, your gains could be 2x, 5x, 10x. But then there are those stable stocks, those the oil and gas companies, the telcos, the banks that generally over time don't lose value. They're always growing. And that kind of long-term growth, like investing in real estate, for example, real estate generally doesn't go down. We have ups and downs, but we're never going to hit a point where a house is cheaper than what your grandparents paid for their house 60 years ago. It's just not likely to happen. And so understanding that seeing all of these competitive threats, existential threats, and drilling them, working to practice them so that we're not surprised by them or dismantled by them when they pop up in the future. I can understand why a lot of executives would say, yeah, but that doesn't make us money this year. That's not what's going on in the shareholder report. But for the same reason that you buy insurance, there has to be some investment in the long-term durability of the company. And I think the only way to get that is not to wait for the moment to come and see how we work under fire, but to practice working under those conditions. To me, that's a long-term view that balances a short-term view of success. And simply running around like chickens without heads is not a great formula for success. And it's not a great formula for wellness for our people either.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's talk our last topic of this interview. Let's talk about the future of antifragility and leadership. As we look ahead, the pace of change is only accelerating. So do you see antifragility as an essential trait for all organizations in the future, or it's more applicable to a specific type of industries or companies?
I think that if you look at the human condition as a reference, the human body is always undergoing change. Moment to moment, nothing is the same as it was a couple of moments ago. Your cells have changed. Your environment has changed. Threats from around you are constantly moving and constantly changing. And so I think that this is more relevant than it used to be. There was a time, especially when we made the move from local organizations to global organizations, probably 20, 25 years ago, we thought that size was the answer to every problem. Size means we have way more to invest in controls and we have way more to invest in processes and we can have an infinite supply of people, but it doesn't control for the fact that when a market's volatile, size makes you slower. And so I think as we start to see some aspects of globalization come undone, and we see a lot of people, for example, joining the creator economy, becoming entrepreneurs, we see more global organizations fail for various reasons. It should be obvious that being able to thrive in rapidly changing environments is a good thing. And because the rate of change is accelerating, we can expect, you remember when ChatGPT, like the big metric everyone was using a year or two ago, is how many days to adoption. So Instagram Threads came out, it was the fastest app in history to reach whether it was 1 million users or downloads or whatever the metric was. And ChatGPT was likewise very, very quick to penetrate the market and capture every user's attention. Those things can happen like that. There's no warning. You don't read about it in the news months ahead of time saying this is going to be big. It just all of a sudden shows up and it's big. That didn't happen before. So my belief is that more than ever, the willingness to throw ourselves into uncertainty and ask what if questions and to do what if things, to run those scenarios, is more important than it ever has been.
Very good. Lastly, Chris, if you were to give one piece of advice to a leader who is unsure about embracing antifragility, what would it be?
I would say find a small group of people and ask them to commit to one thing. That one thing is lean into your fear zone every day. Do one thing that frightens you a little. That could be meeting a new person. I mentioned before, it could be jumping in front of a camera or jumping on stage to speak to people in a public forum. Anywhere where there's some risk. Not big risk, like you might get knocked out or you might get hurt. I'm talking about risk to your ego mostly. I might be wrong. I might look foolish. I might cost the organization some time or some money or some resources. Anything like that. And put it into your calendar to spend 20 minutes doing it. Because once you've tested and seen what it feels like to stretch beyond what you think you're capable of, to test yourself under all kinds of competitive conditions, mindset conditions, psychological conditions, to test your ability to survive the things that you fear, you'll realize, oh, there's nothing really to fear. It makes the decision to jump into anti-fragility much easier. That one simple practice, simply every day challenge yourself to lean into your fear zone and do one thing that scares you a little. I'm not the first person to come up with that advice, but I understand why it's so powerful. Give it a try.
Okay. Thank you for such an insightful conversation. Your perspective on building anti-fragile organizations offer invaluable guidance for leaders and navigating today's challenges. We really appreciate your time and expertise on this. And to our listeners, we hope this conversation inspires new ways to approach resilience and growth within your own teams and organizations. Thank you for tuning in, and stay tuned for more insights on building adaptive, forward-thinking businesses. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Cuando crees que un reto es grande, hay aún uno mayor esperándote. Gracias por escuchar el podcast Apasionados por la Tecnología. Puedes seguirnos en Twitter en @paradigmate y suscribirte a nuestra newsletter en paradigmadigital.com.